The call came at midnight. Get to the hospital, now. And Nora ran. No coat, no umbrella. Straight into the worst night of her life. A few weeks earlier, everything was fine. Then one night, her father was rushed to the hospital, and Nora understood nothing about their life would be simple again. Her mother couldn't leave his side. The bills kept coming anyway. Rent, tuition, and Nora realized someone had to carry it all now. That someone was her. No time to break down. No time to cry. Nora tied on that apron and got to work. Whatever it took to keep them going. Class all day, work all night. Somewhere in between, she was supposed to study, sleep, breathe. She kept telling herself she could handle it. Barely. Then the register came up short, and her manager already knew who to blame, not the guy who did it. The exhausted new girl who never had a chance. Here's the thing about doing everything right. Sometimes it still isn't enough. Nora had shown up early, stayed late, never once complained. And now she was standing in the middle of that diner, apron in her hands, being told not to come back. For something she didn't even do. 20 years old, holding the one job that kept her whole family afloat. And just like that, gone. But to understand how she got here, you have to go back. Go back a few weeks. To the night everything changed. One minute they were home, just an ordinary evening. The next, an ambulance. Flashing lights in the rain, and Nora running through a hospital hallway with her heart in her throat. Her father was somewhere behind those doors, and nobody would tell her if he'd be okay. She just stood there, waiting. And in that moment, she felt her whole life tilt sideways. Before all that, life was simple, ordinary even. Family dinners that ran too long. Her dad cracking the same terrible jokes he'd told 100 times. Her little sister stealing food off everyone's plate. Her mom pretending to be annoyed about it. Money was tight. It always had been. But they had each other. And back then, Nora figured that was the hard part of life. She had no idea what was coming. Nora was in her second year, first in her family to ever make it to college, and she took that seriously. Front row, every class, notes on everything. She wasn't the loudest one in the room. She was the one who always showed up ready. Her professors knew her by name. Her future felt close enough to reach out and touch. All she had to do was keep going, just keep going. That was the plan anyway. It happened without warning. 1 second her dad was fine, reaching for the remote. The next, he grabbed his chest and everything just stopped. Her mother screaming his name. Nora fumbling for the phone with shaking hands. Her little sister frozen in the doorway, too scared to move. Those few minutes felt like hours. The kind of minutes that split your whole life clean in two, a before and an after. And nothing was ever going to be the same. The doctors did everything they could. And after the longest night of her life, there was finally news. Her father had pulled through. Nora nearly broke down crying right there in the hallway. But relief has a short shelf life. Because the same doctor who saved him wasn't finished talking. His heart was weak now. He'd need time to recover. Real time, months maybe. And no work, none at all. And that's when the second wave of fear hit. Her dad was the one who kept them all going. The early shifts, the overtime. Every bill in that house had his name behind it. And now he couldn't lift a finger for months. Nora sat by his bed, watched him sleep, and did the math no 20-year-old should ever have to do. Rent, groceries, her own tuition, her sister's school, all of it. resting on a family that had just lost its only income. Somebody had to catch them. They brought him home a week later, and their whole world shrank down to one room. Her mom became a full-time nurse overnight, meals, medicine, helping him just to stand up, which meant her mom couldn't work either. Her little sister tiptoed around the house, scared to make a sound. And Nora? She stood in that doorway one night and understood something cold and clear. Somebody in this family had to step up now, and it was going to be her. The envelopes started stacking up. Red letters, final notices, and then the one that hit the hardest, her tuition, due in a matter of weeks. The thing she'd worked her entire life for, about to slip right through her fingers. She could drop out, get a full-time job somewhere. But then every sacrifice her family ever made would have been for nothing. So she made a decision. Study by day, earn by night. Somehow, she'd carry all of it herself. She applied everywhere, a dozen places, maybe more. And finally, one said yes. A busy little diner across town, hiring for the night shift. The manager barely looked up when he took her on. Didn't bother learning her name the first time, but it was a paycheck. And right then, a paycheck was everything. So Nora tied on that apron with a shaky kind of hope and told herself this was the answer. She had no idea what this job was about to cost her, and so began the double life. You want to know what her days actually looked like? Here, up at 6, lectures until 3, a 20-minute bus ride across town, textbook open on her lap the whole way, then the apron, then the floor. Tables 7 through 15, every single night until well past midnight. The diner was always packed, always loud. Truckers, night owls, people coming off their own late shifts. Orders flying at her from every direction. And Nora learned fast, because she had to. How to carry 4 plates without dropping one. How to smile at a rude customer and mean none of it. How to keep the tips coming when the tips were the only thing standing between her family and the edge. She was good at it too. Regulars started asking for her section. The cooks liked her because she never messed up an order twice. But here's the part nobody saw. The bus ride home at 1 in the morning, forehead against the cold window. The homework she still hadn't touched. The 3 hours of sleep, if she was lucky. Then the alarm again. She told herself it was temporary, just until her dad got back on his feet, just for a little while. That's what she kept telling herself anyway. Not everyone at that diner was a stranger for long. There was Rosa. 20 years on that same floor, and she'd seen every kind of person walk through the door. The first night, she watched Nora nearly cry over a spilled tray, walked over, and just said, "Breathe, honey. Everybody drops the first one." After that, Rosa kind of adopted her, saved her the good tables, covered for her when she was dead on her feet, slid her an extra coffee on the brutal nights without saying a word about it. And Nora needed that, more than she let on. Because carrying a whole family at 20 is a lonely thing. Her mom was drowning at home. Her sister was scared. Her dad was fragile. There wasn't anyone left for Nora to lean on. Except this woman. This kind, tired, been-through-it woman who kept an eye on her like a daughter. One night Rosa looked at her and said something Nora never forgot. "You've got something, kid. People notice. Don't let this place grind it out of you." Nora smiled, said thanks. But honestly, she was too exhausted to believe it. She had no idea that someone else was already noticing her, just not in a good way. Then there was Kyle. And Kyle was a whole different story. He'd been at the diner longer than Nora, though you'd never guess it from the way he worked, which was mostly not working. He had a gift for disappearing right when the rush hit, for being on his phone when the register line backed up, for leaving his mess on Nora's shoulders and somehow never getting caught. She didn't say anything at first. New girl, keep your head down. That was the rule. But it started adding up. The nights she stayed late cleaning his tables. The drawer that never quite balanced when he closed it. The little, "Can you cover this?" that always landed on her. And Kyle? He was smooth, charming with the manager. All jokes and easy smiles when the boss was around. The kind of guy who's really, really good at making sure the blame never sticks to him. Nora noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. But noticing and proving are two very different things. And she was too tired, too stretched thin, too scared of losing this job to make waves. So she let it slide, told herself it wasn't her problem. That was the mistake. Because Kyle was about to make it very much her problem. Something had to give. And it did. Slow at first, so slow she barely noticed. A reading she didn't get to. An assignment turned in a day late. Then she started nodding off in class. Front row, the seat she used to own, her head dipping toward the desk while the professor kept talking. She'd snap awake with her heart going, praying nobody caught it. Somebody always caught it. Her grades started to slide. And these were grades she'd worked years for. A B showed up where there'd never been one. Then a C. One afternoon, a professor kept her back after class. Real concern on his face. He asked if things were okay at home. Nora just nodded. Told him she was fine. Because what was she going to say? That she was on her feet past midnight so the lights stayed on back home? Here's what got to her, though. She was doing it all right. Every bit of it. Nobody was working harder than her. And it still felt like she was losing ground everywhere she looked. Some nights on that late bus, she'd just stare out the window at nothing, wondering how long a person can run on empty before something gives. She didn't know yet. She was about to. It was a Thursday. Closing time. The place was empty, chairs up on tables, and Nora was counting down the register like she did every night. Except the numbers weren't adding up. She counted again. And again. Slower this time. The drawer was short. Not by a little, by a lot. Her stomach dropped. She sat there staring at the money, trying to make it make sense. She hadn't taken anything. She'd never so much as pocketed a spare quarter in her life. But the math didn't care about that. The money was gone, and she was the one holding the drawer. Here's what she didn't know yet. Kyle had worked the register earlier that night. Kyle, who always closed sloppy. Kyle, whose drawer never balanced. But Kyle had clocked out an hour ago, laughing on his way out the door. And Nora was the last one standing there. She thought about calling the manager right then, getting ahead of it, being honest. But it was late, and she was terrified. And some quiet voice in her head said, maybe it's a mistake. Maybe you counted wrong. Just recount it in the morning. She should have made the call. Because by morning, the story had already been written for her. And she wasn't the hero of it. They called her in first thing the next morning. The manager was already sitting there, receipt in hand, face like a closed door. And Nora knew. Before he said a single word, she knew exactly where this was going. You closed last night, he said, not a question. The drawer was short, badly short. She tried to explain. Told him Kyle had worked the register earlier. Told him she'd counted it 3 times, that she'd never take a cent, that there had to be another explanation. She heard her own voice getting higher, faster, more desperate. Never a good sound. And he just watched her, arms folded, completely unmoved. Because here's the thing. Kyle had already been in that morning, gotten there before her. Told his version first, all easy charm and concern, and pointed the finger right at the new girl, the exhausted one, the one who'd been making mistakes, the one nobody had known for very long. "I've heard enough," the manager said. "You're the one who closed. That's on you. No investigation, no benefit of the doubt. Just a decision already made before she walked in the door." Nora stood there feeling the floor drop out from under her. This job was the only thing holding her family together. And she could see, right in that man's eyes, that it was already gone. And that's how she ended up right back where this whole thing started. Standing in the middle of that diner, untying her apron with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Being told to go. Over something she never did. Part of her wanted to fight. To dig her heels in and tell them they had it all wrong, that Kyle was the one walking out clean while she took his fall. But she looked around. Empty tables. The manager's back already turned to her. And it landed. Nobody here was going to hear a word she said. Kyle had gotten there first, and that was that. So she didn't argue. She folded the apron, left it on the counter, and stepped out into the afternoon with nothing to show for any of it. Rosa caught her at the door, took her hand, eyes fierce, and said it low. "This is wrong, and you know it as much as I do." That was the one decent thing anyone gave her that day. Nora hung on to it. But being right doesn't cover rent. And somewhere on the bus ride home, it all caught up with her. No paycheck, tuition coming due, a dad who couldn't work, a mom who couldn't leave his side. Nothing coming in now. She'd never felt smaller in her life, and that was it. Nora walked out of that diner with nothing. No paycheck, no warning, not even a chance to say her side. Just an apron left on the counter and a boss who'd already decided how the story went. She didn't cry. Not right then. She just walked, down the sidewalk, through the afternoon crowd, past all these people hurrying off to lives that seemed so much simpler than hers. And she felt like a ghost. Like nobody could even see her. Her head kept doing the math she couldn't turn off. Tuition due in 2 weeks. Her dad's medicine. The rent on top of that. All of it landing at once, with nothing coming in to cover any of it. She'd been the one holding this whole family together, and she just felt it slip right through her fingers. And the worst part wasn't even the money. Not in that moment. It was the shame. Picturing herself walking through the front door and telling her mom she'd failed. That the one thing she swore she'd handle, she couldn't. She stopped at a crosswalk and just stared down at the pavement. She'd never felt smaller. What she didn't know was that 30 seconds from now, everything was about to shift. Right on that corner, a car pulled up. And not the kind you see every day. This was the sort of car that costs more than most people earn in a couple of years. Long, black, not a scratch on it. The woman walking toward it fit right in too. Sharp blazer, easy confidence, that polished look money tends to give people. Honestly, Nora barely clocked her. She had way too much on her own plate. But then she caught it. As the woman leaned down to get into the back seat, Something slid out of her bag and hit the pavement behind her. A phone. She didn't notice. Just kept going, one foot already in the car. And this is the part that says everything about Nora, if you ask me. She'd lost her job an hour ago. She was broke and running on empty, about as low as a person gets. That phone was worth more than a whole week of her old paychecks. No one was looking. The woman's back was turned. Plenty of people would have just kept walking. A few might have even slipped it into their pocket. Not Nora. It didn't even occur to her. Because that kind of thing was just how she was built. So she bent down and picked it up. "Excuse me," Nora said, a little out of breath. "You dropped this." The woman turned around, saw the phone in Nora's hand, and her whole face shifted. She checked her bag, realized what had almost happened, and let out this soft breath of relief. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "I didn't even feel it slip. Thank you. Really." But then she did something Nora didn't expect. She actually looked at her. Really looked. And this was a woman who'd spent a lifetime reading people. So she caught it all in a second. The red, tired eyes. The exhaustion sitting heavy on those young shoulders. The fact that this girl was still being kind on what was clearly one of the worst days of her life. "Rough day?" she asked. Gently. Not really a question. Nora managed a small smile. Said she was fine. The woman didn't push. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small card, and pressed it into Nora's palm. "I run a little place a few blocks from here," she said. "If you ever need work or just a decent cup of coffee, you come find me. I mean that." Then she was gone. Into that beautiful car. And Nora stood there, holding a card she never imagined she'd use. A few days passed, and things got worse before they got better. The tuition deadline was almost here now, staring at her in bold red letters. Every place she'd applied to had either said no or said nothing at all. She was running out of road, and fast. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, emptied her bag looking for a pen, and something small fell out. A card. Cream-colored, a little bent at the corner now. The woman from the street. The dropped phone. She'd almost forgotten. Nora turned it over in her fingers. "If you ever need work," the woman had said. At the time, it felt like the kind of thing people say and never mean. A polite goodbye. But sitting there now, out of options, out of hope, she thought. What did she have to lose? She looked up the address, and when she saw it, her stomach did a little flip. This wasn't some corner shop. It was one of the most elegant bakeries in the city. The kind of place Nora had walked past 100 times and never once dared to walk into. She almost talked herself out of it. Almost. But the next morning, she put on her cleanest clothes and went anyway. The second Nora stepped through that door, she knew she didn't fit. This wasn't a bakery, not really. It was something fancier than that. The pastries behind the glass looked almost too pretty to eat, all lined up like little works of art. Everything gleamed. Marble counters, warm gold light, that hushed kind of expensive that made her painfully aware of her beat-up sneakers. She nearly turned around and left. Everyone in here looked like they belonged, and she was very much aware that she didn't. But she'd dragged herself all the way across town for this. So she pulled in a breath and went up to the counter anyway. A young guy working there asked if she needed help, and her voice came out way smaller than she meant it to. She said she was looking for the owner, that the woman had given her a card, told her to stop by if she ever needed work. He gave her a bit of a look, some tired girl in a red hoodie asking for the owner by name. Nora felt her face go hot, already bracing to be told to leave. And then a voice from the back. "It's all right, I've got this one." And there she was. Vivian, smiling like she'd been waiting for her. Vivian remembered her. Of course she did. She waved Nora into the back, sat her down, and poured her a coffee like they were old friends. And she didn't push for the whole story. She just asked gently what had brought her in. So Nora told her, not all of it, but enough. Her father, his health, the family leaning on her, the job she'd lost over something she didn't do. She kept it simple. No tears, no asking for pity. She just laid it out honest and looked Vivian in the eye. Vivian listened to every word. And when Nora finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Nora would never forget. "You know what I saw on that sidewalk? A girl at the end of her rope who still stopped to do the right thing. You can't teach that. I've been hiring for 25 years, and that's the one thing I look for." She reached under the counter and pulled out an apron, slid it across. "Let's start you this week. Good pay, real hours, and we'll work around your classes. Anyone who'd hand back a phone on the worst day of her life is exactly the kind of person I want in here." Nora couldn't speak. She just held that apron and nodded. The pay at that patisserie was better than anything Nora had ever earned. A lot better. And for the first time in weeks, she brought home news that wasn't bad news. She sat her family down that evening and told them. The elegant bakery, the kind owner, the steady, real money. Her mom pressed both hands to her face and just started crying. The good kind of crying she'd been holding back for way too long. Her dad didn't say much. He couldn't, really. He just reached out from the bed, took her hand, and squeezed it. And the look he gave her, pride, relief, and something close to heartbreak that his little girl had carried so much. This was the man who'd held them all up his whole life. And now, finally, he could rest, knowing she'd picked up the weight without ever once complaining. For weeks, that house had felt heavy, fear in every room. And now, for one evening, it felt like a home again. Her little sister curled up next to her and asked if they were going to be okay now. Nora wrapped an arm around her and said, "Yeah, we're going to be okay." And this time, she actually believed it. A couple weeks later, Nora's phone rang. Rosa, her old friend from the diner, and she had news. Turns out the register problems didn't stop when Nora left. They got worse, a lot worse. Money kept going missing on the nights Kyle closed. Shocking, right? And this time there was a security camera the manager had completely forgotten about. It caught everything, every dollar. Kyle, plain as day, doing exactly what he'd let Nora take the blame for. They let him go on the spot. And the manager, Rosa said he actually had the decency to look ashamed. He knew what he'd done. He'd thrown out an honest kid on nothing but a smooth talker's word. And now the truth was sitting right there on a screen he couldn't argue with. He even asked Rosa to pass along a message, an apology, and an offer for Nora to come back, better pay, no questions asked. Nora sat with that for a long moment. The apology she'd wanted so badly, back when it would have meant the world. And you know what she felt? Not anger. Not even satisfaction, really. Just this quiet, steady calm. Because she'd already landed somewhere better. "Tell him thank you," she said. "But I'm exactly where I'm meant to be now." Months went by. And that girl who'd once stood frozen in the doorway, Sure she didn't belong in a place like this? Gone. In her spot stood someone who ran the floor like she'd been doing it for years. She picked it up fast. The recipes, the regulars. Which mornings got slammed and which ones barely moved. And the customers took to her. Not in that fake service smile kind of way. She actually remembered them. Old Mr. Hollis and his almond croissant every single Saturday. The nurse who came in wrecked after night shifts and needed her coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Small things. But people notice when you notice them. Vivian saw all of it. Started leaning on her more, then a lot more than that. And the money changed everything back home. Real money now, steady, landing in her account every 2 weeks like clockwork. Nora sat down one night with a calculator and just started knocking things out. One at a time. The tuition first. Paid in full, on time, and no more of those red envelopes piling up by the toaster. Then the medical bills, the ones that used to make her stomach drop just by existing. She chipped at those month after month until the number stopped scaring her. Until it was only a number again. There was this one evening she caught herself in the back, wiping down a tray, and noticed her shoulders weren't up around her ears anymore. She'd been holding that tension so long she'd forgotten it was even there. She could breathe now, not just push through the day. Actually breathe. And she'd built that herself. On the worst stretch of her life. Nobody handed her a thing. Her dad got better too. Slow though. Recovery doesn't work the way it does in the movies, all at once with music swelling in the background. It comes in tiny pieces you'd miss if you weren't watching. A little more color in his face one week. Steadier on his feet the next. There was one morning Nora would carry with her for the rest of her life. She came down the stairs half asleep, and there he was, standing at the counter, making coffee by himself, humming something low under his breath the way he always used to, before any of it happened. She stopped in the doorway. Couldn't move for a second, because the last time she'd seen him standing in that exact spot, everything had been fine. And then their whole world fell apart in the space of one evening. And now here he was again. Same counter, same awful humming. She had to blink hard a few times so he wouldn't catch her getting emotional over a pot of coffee. The doctors did their part, of course. And her mom, who barely slept for months taking care of him, she carried the weight at home. But there was another reason he got to rest and heal properly instead of dragging himself back to work too early. That reason was standing in the kitchen in a red hoodie, reaching up for 2 mugs. He didn't make some big speech about it. That was never his way. He just looked over at this daughter of his, the one who'd quietly held everything up while he couldn't, and he said, "I'm proud of you, kid." 4 words, that was all. And it was everything. Vivian turned into something Nora never saw coming. Not just a boss. Something a lot closer to family. They'd stay late after closing sometimes. Vivian would pour 2 coffees, kick her shoes off, and tell stories from 25 years of running the place. The customers she'd loved, the ones she couldn't stand. That one brutal month early on when she almost lost the whole shop and had to sell her car just to make rent. One of those nights, Nora finally asked the thing that had been sitting quietly in the back of her head for months. Why me? That day on the street. You didn't know one single thing about me. You could have just grabbed your phone and driven off. Vivian didn't jump to answer. She looked down at her coffee for a good while first. Because I've stood exactly where you were standing, she said. Long time ago now. Broke, scared out of my mind, holding a whole family together with 2 hands and nobody to help. She gave this little shrug. Somebody took a chance on me back then. Had no real reason to. And it changed the whole direction of my life. So I promised myself, if I ever caught that same thing in another person, I'd pass it on. And that afternoon, I caught it in you. Nora sat with that one for a long, long time. It's a strange thing to think about. She'd hit the lowest point of her life, lost her job over somebody else's lie, and every awful bit of it had somehow carried her to this exact chair, across from this exact woman. She wasn't sure what to call that. She just knew she was thankful for it. That summer, for the first time in longer than anyone cared to count, the whole family sat down to dinner together. All 4 of them. Her dad back at the head of the table, healthy, arguing about something dumb on the news. Her mom actually relaxed for once, laughing so hard at one of his terrible jokes she had to set her fork down. Her little sister would not stop talking. School, her friends, some drama over a group project, regular kid stuff, the kind of noise that fills a house right up and makes it feel alive again. And that heaviness, the thing that had lived in every room for months, where everybody whispered and tiptoed and waited for the next piece of bad news. It just wasn't there anymore. Something warmer had moved in where it used to sit. Not quite the way things were before all this. Better in some ways. Because now they knew exactly what they could get through. Nora glanced around the table at one point and felt something settle in her chest. They'd come so close to losing all of it. There were nights she'd been flat out certain they would. And here they were instead. Everybody in one room. Safe. Fed. Laughing over nothing at all. She thought about the version of herself from a few months back. Terrified, barely sleeping, dead sure she couldn't carry a single bit of it. And she wished, just for a second, she could reach back and tell that girl to hold on, that it works out. Not easy, but it works out. Her sister elbowed her and asked what she was grinning about. Nora just said nothing and passed the bread. After dinner, nobody rushed to get up. They just sat there a while longer, the plates empty, her dad telling some story they'd all heard a dozen times. And for once, no one was checking the clock or bracing for bad news. Nora looked at her mom across the table, and her mom gave her this small, knowing nod. Like a thank you, neither of them needed to say out loud. That was enough. That was more than enough. These days, Nora's life looks a little different. Classes in the morning, the one thing she almost had to give up and somehow never did. The bakery in the afternoons, the place that handed her a shot right when she'd run clean out of them. And a home that feels like a home again. It's still a lot. Long days. Not enough sleep some weeks. But it's a good kind of tired now. The kind you choose for yourself. Not the kind that's slowly flattening you. And here's the part she turns over sometimes. On the bus, watching the city slide past the window. The people who threw her away. The manager who wouldn't hear a word she said. The guy who lied and let her eat the blame for it. They didn't win. Not really. Because losing that job is the exact thing that put her on that street corner. And a phone slipping onto the pavement is the exact thing that walked her straight into this whole new life. She quit waiting around for the world to be fair a while ago. Now she just does the right thing when it's sitting there in front of her, keeps her head down, works, and trusts it'll find its way back to her eventually. For her, it did. took its sweet time. But it did. So if you happen to be sitting in the middle of your own worst chapter right now, feeling like you did everything right and got handed nothing for it, just hold on a little longer. You really never know what's waiting for you around the next corner. Nora sure didn't. And look at her now.